The storm rolled across the plains like a living thing, churning dust into angry clouds that clawed at the horizon. Lightning fractured the darkening sky, illuminating the lone rider who approached the small town of Redemption, Wyoming. The year was 1885, and the West was still wild enough for a man to reinvent himself, or to be haunted by the ghosts of who he used to be. Mason Holt pulled his hat lower against the biting sand and urged his tired chestnut mare forward. The town appeared through the haze like a mirage, a collection of wooden buildings clinging to existence against the harshness of the frontier. His eyes, keen from years of watching for the slightest movement that might mean life or death, settled on the modest church steeple that rose above the other structures. As he drew closer, the white cross atop the steeple seemed to pierce the gathering darkness. Mason slowed his horse to a stop before it, removing his hat in a gesture that spoke of respect or perhaps penance. He remained there for a long moment, his weathered face turned upward, eyes closed as raindrops began to fall, mixing with the dust to leave streaks across his sun-browned skin. "Been a long time since I darkened a church door, Lord," he whispered, his voice nearly lost in the growing wind. "Not sure you'd want me to start now." The mare shifted beneath him, eager for shelter, pulling Mason from his thoughts. He replaced his hat, patting the horse's neck. "All right, girl, let's find somewhere dry." Main Street was mostly deserted as the storm drove folks indoors. Mason guided his horse to the hitching post outside the Broken Spoke Saloon, the only establishment showing signs of life. Piano notes spilled from within, accompanied by the low rumble of conversation. He secured his mount, taking extra care with the knot as another rumble of thunder shook the ground. The mare's ears flattened. "Won't be long," he promised, retrieving his saddlebags but leaving his Winchester rifle in its scabbard. The weight of his Colt revolver, hidden beneath his long duster, felt heavier than usual. The saloon fell momentarily silent as Mason pushed through the swinging doors, all eyes turning to assess the newcomer. He was tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of strength earned through hard work rather than leisure. His face, partially hidden beneath several days' growth of beard, bore the lines of a man who'd seen too much too soon. But it was his eyes that drew attention, gray as storm clouds and just as turbulent, scanning the room with the practiced vigilance of someone who had learned the hard way about letting his guard down. The piano player resumed his tune. Conversations slowly rekindled. Mason moved to the bar with measured steps, aware of the lingering gazes. The bartender, a barrel-chested man with a magnificent mustache, placed both palms on the worn wood. "What'll it be, stranger?" "Coffee, if you've got it." Mason's voice was low, graveled by trail dust and disuse. "Or whiskey, if you don't." The bartender raised an eyebrow. "Coffee at this hour, in a saloon?" "Been a long ride." Something in Mason's tone discouraged further questions. The bartender nodded and moved away, returning moments later with a steaming cup. Mason wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into his trail-worn fingers. He turned slightly, positioning himself to observe the room through the cloudy mirror behind the bar. Force of habit. Old instincts died hard. That's when he saw her through the window, a young woman hurrying past in the increasing rain, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders. She was being pursued by a well-dressed man whose face was contorted with anger. Mason wouldn't have paid it much mind. Town business wasn't his concern, until the man caught the woman's arm, spinning her around so roughly she nearly fell. "Rebecca Sullivan!" The man's voice carried through the saloon window, cutting through the piano music. "Your father's debts don't disappear just because he did." The woman, Rebecca, tried to pull away. "Mr. Hammond, please, I've told you I need more time." "Time?" Hammond's laugh was cruel. "You've had months. $8 isn't just going to appear out of thin air, girl." By now, several patrons had moved to the windows to watch the unfolding scene. Mason remained at the bar, but his attention was fixed on the reflection in the mirror. "My father will return," Rebecca insisted, her chin lifted despite the fear in her eyes. "He wouldn't just abandon me." "Your father's a coward who ran rather than face his responsibilities," Hammond sneered, tightening his grip. "Too proud to pay his debts, but not proud enough to stay and protect his daughter." A small crowd had gathered in the street now, drawn by the commotion despite the worsening weather. No one intervened. Mason noted their downcast eyes, the way they shifted uncomfortably but made no move to help. He'd seen it before, good people paralyzed by fear or self-interest. "Let me go," Rebecca demanded, struggling against Hammond's grip. Instead of complying, Hammond reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar, tossing it into the mud at her feet. "There's $1," he announced loudly, clearly playing to the audience. "Pick it up, girl. That's more than you're worth now that everyone knows your family doesn't honor its obligations." Rebecca stared at the coin, then at Hammond, her face flushing with humiliation and anger. "No. Pick it up." Hammond yanked her arm, and the sudden movement tore the fabric of her dress at the shoulder, exposing her skin to the rain and the stares of onlookers. Someone in the crowd chuckled nervously. Mason set down his coffee cup. "Ah, hell," he muttered, pushing away from the bar. He stepped out into the rain, moving with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to entering dangerous situations. The crowd parted instinctively, sensing something in his demeanor that commanded respect, or perhaps fear. Mason removed his duster without breaking stride, revealing the holstered Colt at his hip. He didn't touch the weapon, but its presence didn't go unnoticed. "That's enough," he said, his voice quiet but carrying over the rainfall. Hammond turned, irritation flickering across his face at the interruption. His expression changed when he took in Mason's appearance and the gun at his side. "This doesn't concern you, stranger." Mason draped his coat around Rebecca's shoulders, covering her torn dress. "It does now." He reached into his pocket and withdrew 2 silver dollars, tossing them into the mud next to Hammond's coin. "There, the show's over." Hammond's face darkened. "Do you know who I am?" "No," Mason replied simply, "and I don't care to." He turned to Rebecca, whose wide eyes darted between Mason and Hammond. "Ma'am, are you all right to walk home?" She nodded, clutching his coat around her. Mason offered his arm, which she took after a moment's hesitation. "This isn't over, Sullivan," Hammond called after them as they walked away. "And you, stranger, you've just made a serious mistake." Mason didn't turn around. "Wouldn't be my first," he muttered, guiding Rebecca through the rain-slicked streets. They walked in silence, the only sounds the rainfall and the distant rumble of thunder. Rebecca's small hand trembled on Mason's arm, though whether from cold, fear, or anger, he couldn't tell. The storm had intensified, forcing them to duck under the awning of the general store when the rain became too heavy. "Thank you," Rebecca said finally, her voice barely audible above the downpour. "Most folks in Redemption wouldn't dare cross Wesley Hammond." "I'm not from Redemption." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I gathered that." She studied him with intelligent eyes that seemed older than her years. "May I know the name of my rescuer?" Mason hesitated. Names had power. His had once carried enough to make men reach for their guns or flee a saloon. "Just a man trying to do what's right," he answered finally. Rebecca accepted his non-answer with a nod. "Well, just a man, I'm Rebecca Sullivan, and I truly am grateful." The rain lessened, and they continued their journey. Rebecca directed them toward a small house on the outskirts of town, its paint peeling but the small garden well-tended despite the difficult soil. A porch swing moved gently in the storm winds. "This is me," she said, reluctantly releasing his arm when they reached the steps. She began to remove his coat. "Keep it for now," Mason said. "I'll collect it another time." "You don't even know where I live," she pointed out. The corner of Mason's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Redemption's not that big." Rebecca climbed the porch steps, then turned back. "Will you tell me your name now? I'd like to know who to thank properly when I return your coat." Mason considered her request. There was something in her direct gaze that made lying seem pointless. "Holt," he said finally. "Mason Holt." She nodded as if confirming something to herself. "Good night, Mr. Holt, and thank you again." As Mason turned to leave, the rain finally stopped, the clouds parting to reveal the first stars of evening. He made his way back toward the main street, intending to check on his horse and find lodging for the night. Instead, his feet carried him to the small church he'd noticed upon entering town. The white clapboard building stood silent, its windows dark except for a single light burning in what appeared to be an adjoining residence. Mason climbed the steps slowly and lowered himself onto the top one, removing his hat and placing it beside him. The night air was cool and fresh after the storm, carrying the scent of wet earth and sage. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, lost in thoughts of the panda, when a gentle voice broke the silence. "Churches are generally more effective when entered, friend." Mason turned to find an older man standing in the doorway, a lantern held high to illuminate the porch. He wore the simple black clothing and white collar of a minister, but his kind face and the laughter lines around his eyes suggested a man who found joy in his calling. Wasn't planning on entering, Mason replied, beginning to rise. Apologies if I'm trespassing, Reverend. It's Pastor, actually, Daniel Fletcher. The minister stepped forward, extending his free hand. In God's house turns no one away, trespassing or otherwise. Mason hesitated before accepting the handshake. Mason Holt. A flicker of recognition crossed Pastor Fletcher's face, so brief Mason might have imagined it. The minister gestured to the door behind him. I've got coffee brewing in the parsonage, Mr. Holt. You're welcome to a cup if you'd like to get out of this night air. Mason should have declined, should have tipped his hat, collected his horse, and found a room at whatever passed for a hotel in this town. Moving on was safer, for everyone, but something in the pastor's open expression, or perhaps just the bone-deep weariness of too many days in the saddle, made him nod. Much obliged. The parsonage was a modest two-room affair attached to the rear of the church. A small stove provided both heat and a place for their coffee pot that sent its rich aroma through the simple quarters. Bookshelves lined one wall, their contents ranging from theological texts to well-worn novels. A desk in the corner held papers and an open Bible. Pastor Fletcher gestured to one of two chairs beside the stove. Have a seat. How do you take your coffee? Black is fine. The minister poured 2 cups, handing one to Mason before taking the opposite chair. The firelight cast flickering shadows across the room, illuminating and then hiding their faces in turns. In one such moment of clarity, Pastor Fletcher's gaze lingered on the scar that ran from just below Mason's right eye to the edge of his jaw, a distinctive mark that had featured in more than one wanted poster and dime novel. Been a while since I've seen Mason the Merciful Holt, the pastor said quietly. Word was you died somewhere near the Montana territory. Mason's hand instinctively moved toward his gun before he forced it back to his cup. In a way, I did. Pastor Fletcher nodded, seeming unsurprised by either the confirmation of identity or the response. What brings you to redemption, Mr. Holt? We're a bit off the usual trails. Just passing through, Mason replied, his eyes scanning the room, old habits. Heading north. The pastor sipped his coffee. And yet you've already managed to intervene in the town business. Word travels fast, even in a storm. Wesley Hammond is not a man who forgives being publicly humiliated. Mason shrugged. Wouldn't be the first man to hold a grudge. No, I suppose not. Pastor Fletcher leaned forward, his expression earnest. But it might be worth knowing what you've stepped into. Hammond practically owns this town. The bank, the mercantile, half the businesses pay him protection. Those who can't or won't, he trailed off, his meaning clear. Like Rebecca Sullivan's father? The pastor nodded. Joseph Sullivan owned a small carpentry shop, borrowed money from Hammond for supplies after a fire destroyed his workshop. The terms seemed fair at first, but Hammond has ways of making debts grow beyond the original agreement. And Joseph ran rather than pay. That's Hammond's version, Pastor Fletcher replied. Others believe Joseph left to find proof of Hammond's dishonest dealings. Either way, he disappeared 6 months ago, leaving Rebecca to face Hammond's increasingly aggressive collection efforts alone. Mason set down his cup, the ceramic making a soft clink against the wooden table. Not your typical pastor's concerns. A wry smile crossed Fletcher's face. The Lord's work takes many forms, Mr. Holt. Sometimes it's offering spiritual guidance. Other times, it's simply being aware of the wolves among the flock. He studied Mason with shrewd eyes, which brings me back to you. The Mason Holt I heard about was a feared gunslinger who, oddly enough, never shot a man who'd surrendered his weapon, hence the peculiar nickname. That was a lifetime ago. Was it? Pastor Fletcher nodded toward Mason's hip, where the Colt rested. You still wear the tools of that trade. Mason fell silent, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames in the stove. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, weighted with memory. 5 years ago, I swore I'd never draw this gun again. Made that promise after a shootout in Silver Creek went bad. Real bad. He rubbed his thumb across the rim of his coffee cup. A child died, 8 years old, caught by a stray bullet when her mother tried to pull her to safety. The pastor remained silent, allowing the confession to unfold at its own pace. I threw my guns in the river that night, Mason continued. Swore I was done. Took up ranching in a quiet corner of Montana. For 5 years, I kept that vow. His jaw tightened. 3 months ago, a family of settlers took shelter in my barn during a storm. A group of bandits followed them, wanted their wagon, horses, whatever they could take. They had already killed the father. The memory played across his features, the terror in the mother's eyes, the children huddled behind her, the approaching hoofbeats in the rain. There was a rifle mounted above my fireplace. Hadn't touched it in years. Mason's eyes met the pastor's. That night I broke my vow. Shot 3 men to save that family. He shook his head slowly. Should have felt like the right choice. But all I could think was that I'd failed. That I was right back where I started. Pastor Fletcher considered this, his expression thoughtful. Perhaps God had a purpose in bringing you to that moment. And perhaps he has one in bringing you here now. A sharp knock at the door interrupted whatever Mason might have replied. The pastor rose to answer it, revealing a rain-soaked Rebecca Sullivan on the threshold, her face pale with urgency. Pastor Fletcher, I'm sorry to disturb you so late, but... Her words faltered as she caught sight of Mason. Mr. Holt, I didn't expect to find you here. Mason stood, noting the fear in her eyes. What's happened? It's my father, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. He's back. He returned tonight after you left. But Hammond's men, they're searching for him. Someone must have seen him enter our house. Pastor Fletcher placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Where is Joseph now? Still at the house. He's injured, his leg. He can barely walk. She turned pleading eyes to Mason. Mr. Holt, I know I have no right to ask, but I'll help, Mason said simply, already reaching for his hat. The three of them moved swiftly through the now clear night, keeping to shadows and back alleys. Rebecca led them to her home by a circuitous route, pausing frequently to ensure they weren't followed. The small house was dark except for a single candle burning in a back room, its flame visible through half-drawn curtains. Wait, Mason said as they approached, his hand moving instinctively to his revolver. Something's not right. He motioned for Rebecca and Pastor Fletcher to remain hidden behind a stand of junipers while he circled the property. The house appeared undisturbed, but Mason's instincts, honed by years of survival in hostile territory, sensed danger. He returned to where the others waited. The back door's ajar, he whispered. Stay here. No, Rebecca insisted. It's my father. Mason recognized the determined set of her jaw and nodded once. Stay behind me then. Pastor, perhaps you should remain where I'm needed, Fletcher finished firmly. Lead on, Mr. Holt. Mason drew his revolver, holding it ready as he approached the back entrance. The door hinges creaked as he pushed it fully open, the sound unnaturally loud in the night stillness. The kitchen beyond was dark, illuminated only by faint moonlight through the windows. A chair lay overturned. A plate had shattered on the floor. Signs of a struggle. Father? Rebecca called softly, her voice tight with fear. A muffled groan answered from the adjacent room, the one where they'd seen the candle. Mason moved forward, senses alert for any trap. He pushed open the connecting door with the barrel of his gun. A man lay on a narrow bed, his face bruised, one leg wrapped in a crude bandage. His eyes widened in fear as the door opened, then in recognition as Rebecca pushed past Mason. Rebecca, he gasped, reaching for her with a trembling hand. You shouldn't have come back. They know I'm here. Shh, Father, it's all right. I've brought help. She turned to the others. Pastor Fletcher, you know, and this is Mr. Mason Holt. Joseph Sullivan's reaction to Mason's name was immediate and unexpected. He attempted to sit up, wincing at the movement. Mason Holt, the same Mason Holt who saved a group of settlers from a Blackfoot attack near Silver Creek 15 years ago? Mason stared at the older man, searching his haggard features. Memory stirred, a younger version of this face, wide with terror, as arrows rained down on a small wagon train. Mason had been riding with a U.S. Marshal then, one of his first jobs after leaving home. That was a long time ago, Mason said carefully. Not so long that I'd forget the man who saved my life and my daughter's. Joseph looked at Rebecca. You were only 10, too young to remember much. But this man, he rode into a hail of arrows to pull you and your mother to safety when our wagon overturned. Rebecca's eyes widened as she looked at Mason with newfound wonder. You never said, I didn't recognize you, Mason admitted. You've grown up. God works in mysterious ways indeed, Pastor Fletcher murmured. The moment of recognition was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Mason moved to the window, carefully peering through the curtains. 3 riders approached, their silhouettes unmistakable against the moonlit road. Hammond's men, he said grimly. We need to move. I can barely stand, Joseph protested. Then we'll have to make a stand here, Mason replied, checking his ammunition. 6 bullets in the cylinder, another dozen in his pocket. Not enough if Hammond had sent more men than those visible. No, Pastor Fletcher interjected. There's a root cellar. The entrance is hidden beneath the rug in the kitchen. Joseph, can you manage that far with help? The older man nodded grimly. With my daughter's assistance. Mr. Holt and I will create a diversion, the pastor continued. Make them think we fled in another direction. Mason raised an eyebrow at the minister's unexpected tactical thinking. You've done this before, Pastor. Fletcher's smile was tight. The Lord's work, as I said, takes many forms. The plan formed quickly. Rebecca and her father would hide in the root cellar while Mason and Pastor Fletcher led Hammond's men away from the house. They would rendezvous at the church when it was safe. As they helped Joseph to the kitchen, Rebecca paused, looking at Mason intently. Why are you helping us? You don't even know us. Mason considered her question seriously. Maybe I'm trying to keep a different kind of vow. They barely had time to conceal Joseph and Rebecca in the cellar and replace the rug before the front door splintered inward. Mason and Pastor Fletcher slipped it out the back, circling around the side of the house as Hammond's men entered. Sullivan, a rough voice called. We know you're here. Mason and the pastor crouched in the shadows of a nearby shed, watching as a 4th man, previously unseen, took up position as a lookout near the horses. In the moonlight, Mason caught a clear view of his face and felt a jolt of recognition that nearly made him gasp aloud. Caleb Reed, his former friend and fellow gunslinger, the man who had been with him at Silver Creek 5 years ago, when the child died. Mason, Pastor Fletcher whispered, noting his sudden tension. Mason shook his head, forcing himself to focus on the immediate danger. We need to draw them away, he whispered. I'll create a distraction at the far end of the property. When they investigate, get to your horse and ride visibly toward the church. And you? I'll make sure they follow you, then double back to ensure Rebecca and her father are safe. Pastor Fletcher studied him for a moment, then nodded. Be careful, Mr. Holt. I believe God has more work for you yet. Mason moved silently through the darkness, making his way to the small barn at the rear of the property. He found a lantern hanging by the door and a pile of dry hay inside. A minute later, flames began to lick at the barn's exterior wall, small at first, then growing rapidly. The effect was immediate. Shouts of alarm came from the house, followed by the thunder of boots as Hammond's men rushed to investigate the blaze. Mason remained hidden, watching as Pastor Fletcher seized the opportunity to mount his horse and gallop off toward town, drawing the attention of the lookout, of Caleb. There, someone's getting away, Caleb shouted, spurring his own horse in pursuit. 2 of the men followed, leaving one behind to investigate the fire. Mason circled back to the house, approaching from the blind side. The remaining man was inside, still searching. Mason entered silently, his revolver drawn. He found the man in the kitchen, standing suspiciously near the rug that concealed the cellar entrance. Looking for something? Mason asked, his voice deadly quiet. The man whirled, his hand dropping to his gun. Mason's expression didn't change. I wouldn't. A tense moment passed before the man slowly raised his hands. You're making a mistake, mister. Wesley Hammond doesn't forgive those who interfere in his business. So I've heard, Mason gestured with his revolver. Outside, now! He marched the man out at gunpoint, keeping well away from the burning barn, which was now fully engulfed. The fire wouldn't spread to the house. Mason had made sure of that, but it created an effective beacon that would bring others from town soon enough. Get on your horse and ride back to your boss, Mason instructed. Tell him Mason Holt says to leave the Sullivan family alone. The man's eyes widened at the name. Mason the Merciful? You're supposed to be dead. That rumor's been exaggerated. Ride. The man needed no further encouragement, spurring his horse hard toward town. Mason waited until he was out of sight before returning to the house in the hidden cellar. Rebecca, he called softly, pulling back the rug. Joseph, it's safe to come out now. The cellar door creaked open, and Rebecca emerged first, helping her father navigate the narrow steps. Joseph's face was gray with pain, but his eyes were alert. We heard everything, Rebecca said. Are you really the gunfighter they call the merciful? Mason's jaw tightened. That was another life. But you used that name just now, she persisted, to send a message to Hammond. Names have power in these parts, Mason replied simply. Come on. We need to get your father somewhere safe before the rest of Hammond's men return. They couldn't risk the road to town with Joseph's injury and Hammond's men possibly still searching. Instead, Mason led them to a small copse of trees near a creek that ran behind the property. The night was cool but not cold, and the dense foliage provided adequate shelter from prying eyes. Joseph rested against a tree trunk, his breathing labored from the short journey. Rebecca tended to his injured leg, washing the wound with the creek water and rebinding it with strips torn from her petticoat. Mason kept watch, his mind troubled by the unexpected appearance of Caleb Reed. You saved our lives twice now, Mr. Holt, Joseph said finally, breaking the silence. I don't know how I can repay such a debt. There's no debt, Mason replied, his eyes scanning the darkness. But I'd like to know what brought Hammond's men looking for you tonight. Joseph exchanged a glance with Rebecca before answering. I didn't run because of the money I owed, though that's what Hammond wants everyone to believe. I left to find proof of his corruption, records of his loan sharking, of properties seized illegally, of men driven out of town, or worse, when they couldn't pay his exorbitant interest. And did you find this proof? Joseph's expression fell. I had it, a ledger book that recorded everything, the real loans versus what Hammond claimed was owed. Names, dates, amounts, enough to bring him down. He shook his head bitterly. But I lost it on my way back to town tonight, when I was attacked by Hammond's lookouts on the North Road. Mason considered this information. Hammond must know you had it. That's why he's so determined to find you. Yes, Joseph agreed. As long as that book exists, he's vulnerable. But without it, it's just my word against his. And in redemption, that's no contest. Rebecca finished tending her father's wound and moved to sit beside Mason. In the moonlight filtering through the trees, her face was solemn. What will you do now, Mr. Holt? Hammond won't stop hunting you after tonight. Mason had been asking himself the same question. The sensible thing would be to retrieve his horse and supplies, then ride out before dawn. Redemption's problems weren't his concern. He'd already broken his vow once by drawing his weapon tonight. And yet, I'll see you both safely to the church, he said finally. Pastor Fletcher will know what to do next. They waited another hour until Mason was certain no search parties remained in the vicinity, then made their slow way toward town by a circuitous route that avoided the main roads. Joseph leaned heavily on Mason's shoulder while Rebecca led the way, her steps nearly silent in the darkness. The church stood quiet and dark when they arrived, but a gentle knock on the parsonage door brought an immediate response. Pastor Fletcher ushered them inside, his face lined with concern. Thank the Lord you're safe, he said, helping Joseph to a chair. Hammond's men searched half the town, looking for you after they lost the pastor's trail. Have they returned to the Sullivan house? Mason asked. Not yet, but they will by morning. Fletcher busied himself preparing coffee and a simple meal of bread and cold meat. Rebecca. Oh, sure. There are some medical supplies in that cupboard. Your father's leg needs proper attention. While Rebecca tended to Joseph with the pastor's more adequate first aid supplies, Mason stood by the window watching the empty street. His mind worked through their limited options. Hammond clearly had most of the town intimidated. The law, such as it was, probably wouldn't intervene. And now Caleb Reed was involved, a complication Mason hadn't anticipated. You're planning something, Pastor Fletcher observed quietly, joining him at the window. Mason didn't deny it. I've seen men like Hammond before. They only understand one language. Violence isn't the answer, Mr. Holt. Sometimes it's the only answer available. The pastor sighed. There was a reason they called you merciful, wasn't there? not just because you spared those who surrendered. Mason turned to look at him, surprised. You understand that true mercy sometimes requires strength, Fletcher continued, the courage to stand between the predator and the prey. But killing Hammond won't solve redemption's problems. Another man like him would simply take his place. Then what do you suggest, Pastor? Prayer? There was no mockery in Mason's tone, only genuine questioning. Prayer has its place, Fletcher replied, but so does action guided by principle. He lowered his voice further. Joseph mentioned a ledger book. Mason nodded. Says he lost it when he was attacked. The pastor's expression became thoughtful. Perhaps not lost, but taken, and perhaps not beyond recovery. He hesitated. There's something you should know, Mr. Holt. A stranger came to me 3 days ago, a traveler passing through. He gave me a book for safekeeping, said only that it contained the truth about redemption, and that I would know when the time was right to use it. Mason's eyes sharpened. Hammond's ledger? I believe so. I've hidden it within my Bible, the last place Hammond's men would think to look. The revelation changed it everything. With the ledger, they had leverage, evidence that could be taken to the territorial marshal or a circuit judge. Why didn't you say something earlier? Because I didn't know who Joseph Sullivan was, or if his claims were true. Fletcher's gaze was steady. The Bible teaches us to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, Mr. Holt. I needed to be certain before revealing such a powerful weapon. Mason nodded, newfound respect for the pastor evident in his expression. We'll need to keep it hidden until we can get it to the proper authorities. Yes, but whatever Fletcher intended to say was interrupted by a soft gasp from Rebecca. Both men turned to find her standing rigid, staring at Mason with wide eyes. I just realized where I've seen your face before, she said slowly. There was a book of wanted posters in the sheriff's office when I worked there last year. Your face was among them. Mason the Merciful Holt, wanted for the murder of a child in Silver Creek, Montana. The room fell silent. Joseph looked up sharply, his face registering shock. Pastor Fletcher remained impassive, as if he'd already known this information. Mason felt the familiar weight of the past settle on his shoulders. He didn't deny the accusation, didn't attempt to explain. What could he say? That the child's death haunted his dreams every night? That he'd never meant for an innocent to die? Excuses wouldn't change what had happened. Is it true? Rebecca pressed, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Mason met her gaze directly. Yes. The single word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Mason waited for what inevitably came next. The fear, the disgust, the rejection. He'd seen it before in towns across the territories whenever his past caught up with him. But Rebecca's reaction surprised him. Why did they call you merciful? She asked. It wasn't the question he'd expected. Mason glanced at Pastor Fletcher, who nodded encouragingly. I never shot an unarmed man, he said finally. Never shot anyone in the back. And if a man threw down his weapon, I let him live. He gave a humorless laugh. Strange code for a killer, I suppose. Not strange, Rebecca replied thoughtfully. Human. She stepped closer, studying his face as if seeing it anew. The wanted poster didn't mention that you'd saved my life when I was a child, or that you'd risk your life for strangers like us today. The past doesn't change because of present actions, Mason said quietly. No, she agreed, but it can be redeemed by them. The unexpected absolution in her words struck Mason with almost physical force. For 5 years, he'd carried the weight of that child's death, seeking solitude and penance in equal measure. Not once had he considered the possibility of redemption. Pastor Fletcher cleared his throat gently. It's late, and we've all had a trying day. I suggest we get some rest and discuss our next steps in the morning. He gestured to a door leading to a small back room. Rebecca, you and your father can take my quarters. Mr. Holt and I will make do out here. After settling Joseph comfortably in the pastor's bed, Rebecca returned to the main room. She approached Mason, who still stood by the window, his silhouette outlined against the first pale suggestion of dawn. Mr. Holt, she said softly, thank you for your honesty and for everything else. Mason nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As she turned to leave, he found his voice. The child at Silver Creek, he said, the words emerging with difficulty. Her name was Emily. Emily Wilson. She was 8 years old and had red hair like yours. She was running to her mother when he swallowed hard. I need you to know I didn't pull the trigger. But I was there. I was part of the violence that took her life, and I live with that every day. Rebecca's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Then honor her by living a life worthy of the one she lost, she said simply, and disappeared into the back room. Mason stood motionless, her words echoing in his mind. Outside, the eastern sky lightened from black to deep purple, then to the first delicate pink of sunrise. A new day in redemption was beginning, and for the first time in 5 long years, Mason Holt felt the faintest stirring of something he'd thought lost forever. Hope. Pastor Fletcher appeared at his side, offering a cup of fresh coffee. You should get some sleep, Mr. Holt. Mason accepted the cup gratefully. I'm not sure I remember how. The pastor smiled. Faith, hope, and love, Mr. Holt. The greatest gifts and the hardest to recover once lost. He nodded toward the Bible on his desk. But not impossible. Never impossible. As the sun broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across Redemption's dusty streets, Mason sipped his coffee and considered the strange twist of fate that had brought him to this place, to these people. He thought of Joseph Sullivan, whom he'd saved twice across 15 years, of Rebecca, whose forgiveness had been as unexpected as it was undeserved, of Pastor Fletcher and his quiet strength, and of Caleb Reed, whose presence in town could only mean trouble. Whatever peace the dawn had brought was short-lived. A commotion outside drew Mason's attention back to the street, where a group of riders approached at a steady pace. At their head rode a well-dressed man whom Mason recognized from the previous evening's confrontation, Wesley Hammond. Beside him, to Mason's grim acknowledgement rather than surprise, rode Caleb Reed. It appears our time for planning has run out, Pastor Fletcher observed, joining Mason at the window. So it has. Mason set down his coffee cup and checked his revolver. Wake the Sullivans. Get them out the back way if things go badly. And you? Mason's expression hardened as he watched the approaching riders. I'll give them something to focus on besides the Ledger or the Sullivans. Mr. Holt, Mason. Pastor Fletcher placed a restraining hand on his arm. Remember what I said about mercy requiring strength. It also requires wisdom. Mason nodded once, then moved to the door. As he stepped onto the church porch, the morning sun at his back and his hand resting near his holstered weapon, he felt an odd sense of clarity. For years, he'd been running from who he was, from what he'd done. Perhaps it was time to stop running. To face the past, not with a gun, but with something else. Something he'd lost sight of long ago. The riders halted before the church steps. Hammond surveyed Mason with cold calculation, while Caleb's expression remained carefully neutral, though Mason caught the flicker of recognition and surprise in his former friend's eyes. Good morning, gentlemen, Mason called, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. Seems early for a social call. Hammond's smile never reached his eyes. Mason Holt, your reputation precedes you. Does it now? Mason descended the steps slowly. And what reputation would that be? A dangerous man with a soft spot for lost causes. Hammond glanced meaningfully at the church behind Mason. I understand you're harboring fugitives, Mr. Holt, a situation that could turn unpleasant. Mason stopped at the base of the steps, his posture relaxed but alert. The only unpleasantness I've seen in redemption so far involves your business practices, Mr. Hammond. A murmur ran through the group of riders. Hammond's smile tightened. You're new to our town, Mr. Holt. Perhaps you don't understand how things work here. Oh, I understand perfectly, Mason replied, his gaze sweeping over the assembled men before settling on Caleb. Men like you use fear to control others. You prey on the weak because you lack the courage to face equals. Hammond's face darkened with anger. Careful, Holt. Even legendary gunmen can fall. Is that a threat? Mason asked mildly. Consider it friendly advice. Hammond nodded to his men. Search the church. Find Sullivan and his daughter. Mason didn't move from his position at the foot of the steps. I don't think so. The tension in the air thickened. Hammond's men exchanged uncertain glances, none eager to be the first to challenge the infamous gunslinger. Caleb remained impassive, but Mason noted how his hand hovered near his weapon. 5 years ago, Mason said suddenly, his voice carrying to all present, I made a vow never to draw this gun again. He touched the handle of his revolver. Last night, I broke that vow to protect innocent people from men like you, Hammond. I'm not eager to break it again, but make no mistake, I will if necessary. Hammond's laugh was cold. Big words from a man against 6 armed riders. 7, came a voice from the church doorway. Pastor Fletcher stepped out, a shotgun held casually but competently in his hands. Though I prefer not to count myself among your company, Mr. Hammond. A gun-toting preacher, Hammond sneered. How appropriate for a town called Redemption. Even Jesus told his disciples to buy swords, Fletcher replied calmly. There's a time for peace and a time for standing against evil. The standoff stretched, the morning silence broken only by the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof or the creak of saddle leather. Mason kept his gaze fixed on Caleb, recognizing the internal struggle visible in his former friend's eyes. It was Hammond who finally broke the impasse, raising his hand in a gesture of mock surrender. Very well, gentlemen. Keep your fugitives. For now. His cold smile returned. But Redemption is my town. There's nowhere the Sullivans can hide for long. And you, Holt, your welcome here has expired. He wheeled his horse around. Come, men, we have other business to attend to. The riders began to follow, but Caleb hesitated, his eyes locked with Mason's. A silent communication passed between them. Recognition, regret, and something else. A question, perhaps, or a warning. Then Caleb too turned his horse and rode after Hammond, leaving Mason and Pastor Fletcher standing before the church as the dust settled in the morning sun. That won't be the end of it, Fletcher observed quietly. No, Mason agreed, it won't. But as they returned inside to where Rebecca stood waiting, her father's ledger clutched protectively against her chest, Mason felt a strange certainty growing within him. Hammond might control Redemption now, but his reign was nearing its end. And perhaps, in bringing justice to this small corner of Wyoming, Mason Holt might find something he'd thought forever beyond his reach. His own redemption. The midday sun hung mercilessly over Redemption, baking the dusty streets until heat waves shimmered above the packed earth. Inside the church, however, a different kind of tension simmered. Mason stood at the window, watching the town's seemingly normal activities with the practiced eye of a man who had survived by noticing what others missed. Hammond's men patrolled in pairs, their casual demeanor belied by the purposeful way they scanned faces and checked alleyways. They were hunting. They've set up checkpoints at every road out of town, Pastor Fletcher reported, returning from a brief reconnaissance mission disguised as pastoral visits. Hammond is nothing if not thorough. Joseph Sullivan sat at the small table, his injured leg propped on a wooden stool. The color had returned to his face after a few hours of proper rest, but pain lines remained etched around his eyes. We can't stay here forever. The longer we remain, the more danger we bring to you, Pastor. The church has weathered worse storms than Wesley Hammond, Fletcher replied with quiet confidence. Besides, I believe we now have the means to end his reign over Redemption. He moved to the bookshelf and carefully extracted a well-worn Bible, its leather cover cracked with age and use. With reverent hands, he opened it to reveal a hollowed-out section containing a small, leather-bound ledger. Pastor Fletcher placed it on the table before Joseph. Is this what you risked your life to obtain? Joseph's eyes widened. His trembling fingers reached for the book, opening it to confirm its contents. Yes, he breathed. Hammond's true accounting. Every loan, every property seized, every illegal deal for the past 5 years. He looked up at the pastor in wonder. How did you come by this? It was entrusted to me 3 days ago by a traveler passing through town. He gave no name, only said that I would know when to use it. Rebecca, who had been preparing a simple meal at the small stove, turned with sudden intensity. What did this traveler look like? Tall, thin, gray beard. He wore a suit, though travel-worn, spoke like an educated man. Pastor Fletcher paused, noting her reaction. Does that description mean something to you? She exchanged a meaningful glance with her father. It sounds like Thomas Wells, father's former business partner. He left Redemption 2 years ago after a dispute with Hammond. Wells, Joseph mused, his expression clearing with sudden understanding. Of course, he would have kept records too. We both suspected Hammond was manipulating the books. Mason moved from the window to examine the ledger. This gives us leverage, but we still need to get it to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. And Hammond's men aren't likely to let any of us simply ride out of town. There's a circuit judge due in Cooperton next week, Pastor Fletcher offered. It's only 30 miles south. With this evidence, he could issue warrants for Hammond's arrest. Cooperton is still through Hammond's blockade, Mason pointed out. And I don't trust the local sheriff to enforce anything against Hammond, warrant or not. The room fell silent as each person considered their limited options. Rebecca set plates of beans and cornbread on the table, the simple fare a reminder of their confinement. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with, Mason said finally, accepting a plate with a nod of thanks. Hammond's operation, his men, his weaknesses. He fixed his gaze on Joseph. And we need to know about your history with him. The complete history. Joseph pushed his food around his plate, his appetite apparently diminished by the request. It's not a pleasant tale. Few worth telling are, Mason replied. Joseph sighed deeply, setting down his fork. Very well. 5 years ago, when Hammond first came to Redemption, he presented himself as a businessman looking to invest in the town's growth. He bought the bank, then the hotel, then began offering loans to small business owners like myself, who struggled to get fair terms from the bank. His terms seemed reasonable at first, Rebecca continued, taking up the narrative as her father's voice faltered. But there were clauses hidden in the fine print, interest rates that doubled if payments were late, penalties that compounded weekly. Classic loan sharking, Mason observed. Joseph nodded grimly. By the time most of us realized what was happening, we were already trapped. Those who couldn't pay had their businesses seized or were run out of town. Those who complained too loudly met with accidents. But you kept records, Pastor Fletcher prompted. Yes, my partner Thomas and I both did. We suspected Hammond was altering the original loan documents to increase the amounts owed. When Thomas confronted him directly, his shop burned down that night. The official story was a coal oil lamp overturned. But you didn't believe it, Mason said. Thomas left town the next day, warning me to be careful. I continued gathering evidence quietly. Then 6 months ago, Hammond suddenly claimed I owed $8 more than my records showed. When I disputed it, his men ransacked my shop. I knew then that he'd discovered what I was doing. So you fled, Rebecca finished, her voice tight with old pain. Without telling me. Joseph reached for his daughter's hand. To protect you, Rebecca. I thought if I wasn't here, Hammond would leave you alone while I found proof. I never imagined he would. He couldn't finish the sentence, his eyes filling with shame. Use me to flush you out, she said softly. Make an example of me in public. The atmosphere in the small room grew heavy with the weight of Joseph's guilt and Rebecca's quiet hurt. Mason watched them, recognizing the complicated tangle of love and pain that bound them, and the wounds that remained unhealed despite their reunion. You didn't abandon your daughter, Joseph, Mason said finally. You tried to protect her the only way you knew how. He glanced at Rebecca. Sometimes the hardest choices are made with the best intentions. A gentle knock at the back door interrupted the conversation. Pastor Fletcher moved to answer it, his hand resting briefly on the shotgun leaning against the wall before recognition softened his features. He opened the door to admit an elderly woman carrying a covered basket. Mrs. Gunderson, he greeted warmly. Thank you for coming. Least I could do, the woman replied, her sharp eyes taking in the gathered group. Though well into her 60s, Martha Gunderson stood straight-backed with a vitality that belied her age. Her weathered hands, skilled from decades of bringing new life into the world, moved with purpose as she set down her basket. The silver hair neatly pinned beneath her bonnet and the fine lines around her eyes spoke of wisdom, earned through years of witnessing both life's beginnings and its hardships. She nodded at Joseph and Rebecca with familiarity before her gaze settled on Mason. So this is the gunslinger everyone's talking about. Mason didn't respond to the label, but he noted with interest that news of his identity had apparently spread through town. Don't worry, young man, she added with a knowing smile. I've buried enough secrets in this town to fill a graveyard. Yours is safe with me. Her directness reminded Mason of his own grandmother, a woman who'd never wasted words or suffered fools. Mrs. Gunderson set her basket on the table, revealing fresh bread, cheese, and a jar of preserved peaches. Thought you might need proper food if you're planning to take on Wesley Hammond. That man's had this town under his boot heel long enough. Martha is our eyes and ears in redemption, Pastor Fletcher explained. As the midwife, she has access to most homes and hears what people won't say openly. Been delivering Redemption's babies for 43 years, she said matter-of-factly. Brought Wesley Hammond into this world too, Lord help me. His mother was a kind soul, nothing like what her son became. Sometimes I wonder if I should have dropped him. She winked at Rebecca, who couldn't suppress a small smile despite the tension. And what I'm hearing today is that Hammond's offering $50 for information on your whereabouts, she told Joseph directly, plus another $50 for the capture of Mason the Merciful Holt, dead or alive. Mason exchanged a glance with Pastor Fletcher. The bounty complicated matters. What else can you tell us, Mrs. Gunderson? Mason asked. Hammond's gathered most of his men at his office above the bank. Word is he's expecting trouble. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. And that new man of his, Reed, I think they call him, he's been asking questions about you, Mr. Holt. Specific questions. Mason's expression revealed nothing, but inwardly he tensed. Caleb was looking for him personally. That could be an opportunity or a deadly complication. Thank you for the risk you've taken by coming here, Pastor Fletcher said, escorting the older woman back to the door. Pfft, Hammond doesn't scare me. I brought his son into this world and watched him grow into a bully just like his father. She adjusted her shawl. I'll return at dusk with news if there is any. After she departed, Mason turned to the pastor. Hammond has a son? Had, Fletcher corrected. William Hammond died in a shooting at the Broken Spoke 3 years ago. A dispute over cards, allegedly, though some suspected it was connected to his father's business dealings. Mason filed the information away, knowing that grief and vengeance were powerful motivators and potential vulnerabilities. We need a plan, he said, returning to the window to check the position of Hammond's patrols. Pastor, is there a place Joseph and Rebecca can be safe if trouble comes to your door? The church has a hidden room beneath the pulpit, originally built during more lawless days when the church silver needed protection. Fletcher smiled faintly. It's held more valuable things than silver in its time. Good. If Hammond's men come in force, you'll hide there. Mason's gaze shifted to the street outside. I need to speak with Caleb Reed. The man who works for Hammond? Rebecca asked, her brow furrowing in concern. Why would you trust him? Mason considered how to explain the complicated history between himself and Caleb. We rode together once. There was a time I would have trusted him with my life. And now, Pastor Fletcher asked quietly, now I need to understand why he's here, working for a man like Hammond. Mason's jaw tightened. And whether the Caleb Reed I knew still exists beneath whatever he's become. It's too dangerous, Joseph protested. If you're recognized, I'm already recognized, Mason interrupted. Hammond knows I'm in redemption. Better to control when and where I'm seen than to wait for him to find me here. Rebecca studied him with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see more than he intended to reveal. This isn't just about gathering information, is it? This man means something to you. Mason met her gaze steadily. Caleb Reed was with me at Silver Creek, the day the child died. He paused, the admission difficult. He was the one who fired the shot that killed her. The revelation landed heavily in the room. Pastor Fletcher's expression remained compassionate, while Joseph looked stunned. Rebecca's reaction was more complex, surprise giving way to understanding, then to something like sympathy. You took the blame, she said softly. That's why the wanted poster named you. Mason neither confirmed nor denied it. We need information Hammond won't give willingly. Caleb might. Or he might put a bullet in you the moment you're alone, Joseph warned. He's had that chance already, Mason pointed out. This morning at the church. Pastor Fletcher nodded slowly. I noticed the hesitation in him. There's conflict there. Exactly. Mason checked his revolver, more from habit than necessity. I'll go after dark. The fewer people who see me moving through town, the better. Rebecca stepped forward, her expression resolute. I'm coming with you. Absolutely not, Joseph objected immediately. I've worked at the sheriff's office and at the general store, she countered. I know every back alley in Redemption, and a man and woman together attract less attention than a lone stranger, especially one with a price on his head. Mason considered her offer. She wasn't wrong about the tactical advantage of blending in, and her knowledge of the town's layout could prove valuable. Still, he was reluctant to place her in danger. "Rebecca," her father pleaded, "you've already faced Hammond's cruelty once." "And I survived it," she replied with quiet dignity. "I'm not a child anymore, father. This is my fight too." Mason recognized the determination in her stance, the same resolution he'd seen when she stood up to Hammond in the street. "We'll stay to the shadows," he conceded, "and at the first sign of real trouble, you return here immediately. Agreed?" She nodded, relief and something like gratitude flickering across her features. "Agreed." The remainder of the afternoon passed in careful preparation. Pastor Fletcher provided Mason with a rougher set of clothes that would attract less attention than his distinctive duster and hat. Rebecca changed into a simple dress, borrowed from the church charity box, her hair covered with a worn shawl that shadowed her face. Joseph, still unable to move easily with his injured leg, focused on organizing the ledger's information to highlight the most damning evidence against Hammond. As dusk settled over redemption, Mason and Rebecca prepared to depart through the church's rear entrance. Pastor Fletcher offered them a blessing, his hand resting briefly on Mason's shoulder. "Remember, vengeance belongs to the Lord," he said quietly. "Seek justice, not retribution." Mason nodded, understanding the concern behind the pastor's words. "We'll return before midnight." The evening air carried the scent of wood smoke and cooking from the surrounding homes as they slipped from the church grounds into the network of alleys behind the main street. Rebecca moved with surprising stealth, guiding Mason through narrow passages between buildings, avoiding the open areas where Hammond's men patrolled. "Where would Caleb Reed likely be at this hour?" Mason asked softly as they paused in the shadow of the livery stable. "Hammond's men usually take their evening meal at the Broken Spoke," Rebecca replied. "There's a back entrance through the kitchen." They continued their careful progress until they reached the rear of the saloon. The sounds of piano music, laughter, and the clink of glasses drifted through the open windows. A cook stood smoking beside the back door, but he was easily avoided by circling to the side of the building where a narrow staircase led to the upper floor. "The private rooms are up there," Rebecca whispered. "Hammond's men often reserve them for cards." Mason nodded, assessing the best approach. "Wait here," he instructed. "I'll find Caleb and bring him out if possible. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, return to the church." Rebecca caught his arm as he turned to go. "Be careful, Mr. Holt. Redemption needs you." The simple statement, delivered with quiet sincerity, gave Mason pause. He was unaccustomed to being needed, had spent years ensuring no one relied on him after Emily Wilson's death. Yet here was this remarkable young woman, looking at him not with fear or judgment, but with something akin to trust. 20 minutes, he repeated, and disappeared up the stairs. The upper hallway of the Broken Spoke was dimly lit, with doors leading to several private rooms. Mason moved silently, pausing to listen at each door. From the third came the unmistakable sound of Caleb Reed's laugh, a distinctive bark followed by a wheeze that Mason would have recognized anywhere. It had been the soundtrack to many campfires and long rides in years past. Mason positioned himself in a shadowed alcove at the far end of the hall and waited. Patience had saved his life more times than his gun ever had. Sure enough, less than 5 minutes later, the door opened and Caleb emerged, apparently headed for the washroom at the end of the hall. As he passed the alcove, Mason moved. One hand covered Caleb's mouth while the other pressed the revolver into his ribs. Not a threat, merely insurance. "Easy, Caleb," he murmured. "Just want to talk." Recognition flashed in Caleb's eyes, followed by something more complex. He nodded once and Mason released him, though he kept the revolver ready. "Mace," Caleb said softly, using the old nickname from their riding days. "Didn't think I'd see you again after Montana." "Funny how life works out," Mason replied, his voice neutral. "Let's take this conversation somewhere more private." Caleb glanced down the hall toward the room where Hammond's other men remained. "There's a storage room off the kitchen. Nobody uses it this time of night." Mason gestured with the revolver for Caleb to lead the way. They descended a narrow service stair that bypassed the main saloon floor, emerging near the kitchen where the smell of fried beef and beans hung heavy in the air. The promised storage room was little more than a closet, but it offered privacy. Once inside, with the door secured, Mason lowered his weapon but kept it in hand. Caleb leaned against a shelf of preserved goods, his posture deliberately casual, though tension radiated from him. 5 years, Caleb said, breaking the silence. You vanished without a word after Silver Creek. Didn't think there was much to say. Mason studied his former friend in the dim light filtering through the single small window. Caleb had aged, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, a new scar along his jawline, a weariness in his bearing that spoke of hard years. You took the blame, Caleb said quietly, for Emily Wilson. Mason's expression hardened. Didn't matter who pulled the trigger. We were both there, both responsible. But the wanted posters are just paper. Mason leaned forward slightly. Why are you working for Hammond, Caleb? Man like that doesn't match the code you used to live by. A flicker of shame crossed Caleb's features before being quickly suppressed. Times change. Men change. He straightened from his relaxed pose. Hammond pays well and doesn't ask questions about my past. Simple as that. Nothing simple about terrorizing innocent people, Mason countered, forcing young women to humiliate themselves in the street over $8. Caleb's jaw tightened. I wasn't part of that. But you're part of it now. Mason's voice remained level, but there was steel beneath the calm. The Caleb Reed I rode with wouldn't have stood for a man like Hammond. And the Mason Holt I rode with wouldn't have walked away from a fight, Caleb shot back. Yet here you are 5 years later, playing at being a changed man. His eyes narrowed. You still wear your gun. Some habits are hard to break. A tense silence stretched between them. Two men who had once shared everything from food to bullets to blood, now divided by years and choices that couldn't be undone. Why did you come looking for me, Mace? Caleb asked finally. If it's to reminisce about old times, I hate to disappoint you, but those days are gone. I came to understand where you stand, Mason replied honestly, and to give you a chance to stand on the right side again. Caleb laughed, though there was little humor in it. The right side? There's no right side in redemption, just Hammond's side and the losing side. We have his ledger, Mason said quietly, the one Joseph Sullivan risked his life to obtain. Every crooked deal, every loan sharking operation, every piece of property Hammond stole through fraud, all documented. The revelation visibly shook Caleb. He glanced at the door, as if concerned someone might be listening. If Hammond finds out you have that book, he'll what? Come after us? Mason's smile was grim. He's already doing that. Difference is now we have something that can end his grip on this town for good. Conflict played across Caleb's face, the calculation of a man weighing loyalty against conscience, pragmatism against principle. Hammond has men watching every road out of redemption. Even with the ledger, you'll never get it to the authorities. Unless we had help from someone inside Hammond's operation, Mason countered. Someone who knows his plans, his weaknesses. Caleb pushed away from the shelf, pacing the small space like a caged animal. You're asking me to betray a man I've sworn loyalty to. I'm asking you to remember the oath you took long before you met Hammond, the one about standing for something that matters. Don't, Caleb warned, his voice tight. Don't pretend you know me anymore, Mace. 5 years is a long time. Not long enough to forget who you really are. Mason holstered his revolver in a deliberate gesture of trust. Silver Creek changed us both. I ran from what happened there. Maybe you did too, in your own way. But running doesn't erase the past. It just postpones the reckoning. The words struck home. Mason could see it in the way Caleb's shoulders sagged slightly, the defiance in his posture giving way to something more vulnerable. I dream about her sometimes, Caleb admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily. She's always running toward her mother, and I'm always too slow to lower my gun. I know, Mason said simply, because he did know, had lived with those same dreams for 5 years. Caleb took a shuddering breath, composing himself. Hammond's planning something big tomorrow. He's called in men from his other operations in neighboring towns. Whatever you're planning with the ledger, you need to do it soon. The warning was unexpected, a crack in Caleb's loyalty to Hammond that Mason hadn't dared hope for. What kind of something big? I don't know details. Just overheard him telling his foreman to have everyone ready by noon. Caleb moved toward the door. That's all I can give you, Mace, for old time's sake. Mason recognized the risk Caleb was taking even by sharing this limited information. It's a start. It's all you're getting, Caleb replied firmly. Next time our paths cross, I can't guarantee it'll be peaceful. Fair enough. Mason stepped aside to let Caleb reach the door. Just one more thing. A child died because we were both too quick to resort to violence. Remember that before you draw on me or the Sullivans. Caleb paused, his hand on the door latch. Some debts can't be repaid, Mace, no matter how much we might want to. With that cryptic remark, he slipped out, leaving Mason alone with the echo of words that carried more meaning than perhaps either man fully understood. Mason waited several minutes before exiting the storage room, using the same service stairs to return to the alley where Rebecca waited anxiously. Her face brightened with relief when she saw him. You spoke with him? She asked as they began their careful journey back through the town's shadows. I did, Mason confirmed, guiding her around a corner where two of Hammond's men stood smoking. Hammond's planning something for tomorrow at noon. We need to be prepared. Rebecca digested this information as they moved swiftly through the darkness. Do you trust him? Your friend? Mason considered the question seriously. I trust that part of him remembers who he used to be, he said finally. Whether that's enough? I don't know. They continued in silence until they reached the church's rear entrance. Pastor Fletcher admitted them immediately, his worried expression easing at the sight of their safe return. Joseph's been beside himself with concern, he told Rebecca, who hurried to reassure her father. While she related the basics of their excursion, Mason took the pastor aside. Hammond's planning something for tomorrow, he said quietly. We need to move the Sullivans to that hidden room tonight, just as a precaution. Fletcher nodded gravely. I feared as much. Hammond isn't one to let challenges to his authority go unanswered. He studied Mason's face. How was your reunion with Mr. Reed? Complicated, Mason admitted. He's caught between who he was and who he's become. But he gave us a warning, which means there's still something of the old Caleb left. The capacity for redemption exists in all of us, the pastor observed. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us of who we truly are. Mason wasn't certain if Fletcher was speaking of Caleb or himself. Perhaps both. Pastor, there's something I need to tell you about Silver Creek, about what really happened there. Fletcher held up a hand. If it's a confession you seek, I'm willing to listen, but know that I've already heard much of the story from Rebecca. Mason blinked in surprise. She told you? After you left, she thought I should understand the full measure of the man who's risking his life for the Sullivans. The pastor's eyes were kind, but penetrating. She told me you claimed responsibility for a death that wasn't by your hand, that you've carried another man's burden all these years. The simple statement, delivered without judgment, made Mason's throat tighten unexpectedly. It wasn't that simple, he managed. Caleb pulled the trigger, but I brought him to that moment. I was leading our group. The responsibility was mine. Taking responsibility for our actions is admirable, Fletcher said gently. Taking blame for another's choice is a form of pride. Mason stared at him, startled by the perspective. By shouldering Caleb's guilt, the pastor continued, you denied him the opportunity to face his own actions, to seek his own redemption. You took that from him out of a misplaced sense of duty, or perhaps your own need for penance. The word struck Mason with the force of revelation. He had never considered his sacrifice in those terms, had seen it only as protection for a friend, atonement for his own role in the tragedy. He began, but found himself unable to continue. Pastor Fletcher placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. The past cannot be changed, Mr. Holt, but its meaning can be transformed by how we carry it forward. He gestured toward Rebecca and Joseph, who were deep in conversation across the room. These good people need your strength now, not your guilt. Mason nodded, a strange lightness beginning to spread through him, despite the danger that still threatened them all. You're quite the philosopher for a shotgun-toting preacher, he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Fletcher chuckled. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Their conversation was interrupted by Rebecca, who approached with purpose in her stride. We need to get this ledger to the authorities, she said without preamble. Tomorrow, before Hammond can implement whatever he's planning. Every road is watched, Mason reminded her. Not every road, she countered. There's an old trail that runs behind the cemetery, through Miller's Creek, and joins the main road about 5 miles south of town. It's rarely used because it adds nearly 10 miles to the journey, but Hammond's men won't be watching it. Joseph, who had limped over to join them, nodded in agreement. Rebecca's right. I used that trail when I first left Redemption. It's difficult terrain, but passable. Mason exchanged a glance with Pastor Fletcher. If Hammond's gathering additional men for tomorrow, our window of opportunity is narrowing. I'll take the ledger, Rebecca volunteered. I know the trail, and Hammond's men will be looking for my father or Mr. Holt, not me. Absolutely not, Joseph objected vehemently. I'll not have you risking your life alone on that trail. I'm the logical choice, Father. You can barely walk, and Mr. Holt is needed here to protect you and Pastor Fletcher if Hammond makes his move before I can return with help. The debate continued, growing more heated as each person presented their case. Mason listened to the arguments, weighing options and risks with the calculation of someone who had spent a lifetime making life or death decisions. Finally, he interrupted the discussion. Rebecca's right, he said, his tone brooking no argument. She knows the trail and will attract the least attention, but she won't go alone. He turned to Pastor Fletcher. You'll accompany her. The pastor looked surprised. Me, but the church will still be here when you return, Mason finished. Hammond might expect me to attempt an escape with the ledger, or Joseph. He won't be watching for the town pastor and a young woman leaving for an early morning ride. Rebecca considered the plan. We could say we're visiting a sick parishioner in Cooperton. Exactly, Mason agreed. You'll leave at first light, taking the back trail Rebecca described. Joseph and I will remain here to face whatever Hammond has planned for noon. It's too dangerous, Joseph protested. If Hammond discovers you're harboring me, then I'll deal with him, Mason said simply. One way or another, this ends tomorrow. The gravity of his words settled over the group. They all understood what he was not saying, that if Rebecca and Pastor Fletcher failed to return with help in time, Mason might be forced to confront Hammond and his men directly. A confrontation that, regardless of outcome, would likely end with bloodshed. There must be another way, Rebecca said softly, her eyes meeting Mason's with quiet intensity. Sometimes the only way forward is through the fire, he replied. You focus on getting that ledger to someone with the authority to use it. Let me worry about Hammond. The die was cast. They spent the next hour preparing for the morning's journey, gathering supplies and planning contingencies. Pastor Fletcher retrieved a small pistol from his desk drawer, a relic from my days before the cloth, he explained, while Rebecca studied the ledger one last time, committing the most damning evidence to memory in case the book itself was lost. As the preparations wound down, Mason found himself standing once more at the window, gazing out at the quiet streets of Redemption. The town slept, unaware of the forces gathering that would determine its future. Hammond's tyranny, built on fear and fraud. Joseph's quest for justice, born of personal loss. Rebecca's courage, forged in adversity. Pastor Fletcher's quiet strength, rooted in faith. And his own role in this unfolding drama. A man with a violent pitchstand seeking some measure of peace. The irony wasn't lost on him that he might find it only by risking a return to violence. A soft footfall alerted him to Rebecca's approach. She joined him at the window, her presence a calming counterpoint to his troubled thoughts. You should rest, he said without looking at her. Dawn comes early. So should you, she replied. Yet here we both stand. The observation drew a small smile from him. Fair point. They remained silent for a moment, the comfortable quiet of two people who had somehow, in the space of mere days, developed an understanding that transcended words. May I ask you something, Mr. Holt? Rebecca finally said. Mason, he corrected gently. After all we've been through, I think we're past formalities. Her smile was brief but genuine. Mason, then. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Why did you stay? You could have ridden out of Redemption after helping me that first night. None of this is your fight. It was a question he'd asked himself more than once over the past 2 days. The answer had evolved with each passing hour. At first I stayed because it seemed wrong to leave you and your father unprotected, he admitted. Then because Hammond needed to be stopped, and I had the skills to help. And now, she prompted when he fell silent. Mason turned to look at her fully, struck anew by the quiet strength in her face, a face that had seen hardship but refused to be hardened by it. Now I stay because for the first time in 5 years, I'm not running from who I am, he said honestly. For better or worse, this is where I'm meant to be. Rebecca studied him with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see beneath his surface. The gunfighter with mercy in his heart, she said softly. I think Emily Wilson would be proud of how you've honored her memory. The unexpected absolution in her words struck Mason deeply. Before he could respond, she continued, when I was 10 and you saved us from that attack, I remember very little of the fighting. But I do remember afterward, a tall man with kind eyes checking to make sure I wasn't hurt, giving me his canteen to drink from. Her smile was tinged with wonder at the memory. I didn't know it then, but that moment shaped how I saw the world. That even in the midst of violence, there could be kindness. Mason had no memory of this small act of compassion. It had been one rescue among many during his years riding with the Marshal Service. Yet to Rebecca, it had been formative. The realization humbled him. We should both get some rest, he said finally, uncomfortable with the direction of his thoughts. Tomorrow will test us all. Rebecca nodded, but before turning away, she reached out to touch his arm lightly. Whatever happens tomorrow, Mason Holt, redemption is better for having known you. She left him then, returning to the small cot where her father already slept. Mason remained at the window a moment longer, watching as clouds drifted across the moon, alternately revealing and concealing the sleeping town below. Redemption. The name seemed both ironic and fitting, a place where second chances were hard-won, but perhaps not impossible. A place where a man running from his past might finally find the courage to face it. As Mason finally settled into his makeshift bed on the parsonage floor, he thought of Caleb, of Joseph, of Rebecca and Pastor Fletcher, of Emily Wilson and the debt he could never repay, of paths taken and abandoned, of choices that echoed across years and lives. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. For tonight, he would rest, gathering strength for the reckoning that awaited them all when the sun rose over redemption. Dawn broke over redemption with fingers of pale gold stretching across the eastern sky. Mason stood in the shadows of the church's rear entrance, watching as Pastor Fletcher secured the last of their provisions to his sturdy bay gelding. Rebecca checked the cinch on her own mount, a dappled mare borrowed from Mrs. Gunderson's small stable. Stay to the tree line until you're well past the cemetery, Mason instructed quietly. If you're spotted, don't try to outrun them. Find cover and wait them out. Pastor Fletcher nodded, his normally gentle face set with determination. He had exchanged his clerical collar for a plain shirt and vest, looking more like a farmer than a man of the cloth. We'll reach Cooperton by midday if all goes well. Judge Harmon is a fair man and won't ignore evidence this damning. Rebecca approached Mason, her eyes bright with a mixture of resolve and concern. The ledger was safely stowed in her saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the elements. What if Hammond moves before we can return with help? Then Joseph and I will handle it, Mason replied simply. Focus on your task. Get that ledger to the judge. She studied his face intently, perhaps searching for reassurance he couldn't honestly give. Instead of empty promises, Mason offered something else. Rebecca, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Whatever happens today, remember that you've shown more courage than most men I've known. Your father is proud of you, as am I. A soft flush colored her cheeks at the unexpected praise. She reached out impulsively and clasped his hand. Be careful, Mason. Redemption still needs you. Before he could respond, she turned and mounted her horse with practiced ease. Pastor Fletcher was already astride his gelding, the reins gathered in competent hands. May God watch over you both, the pastor said, touching the brim of his hat in farewell. Mason nodded once, and you. He remained in the shadows as they guided their horses down the narrow track behind the church, disappearing into the early morning mist that clung to the low-light barns. Only when they were completely out of sight did he return inside, closing and barring the door behind him. Joseph Sullivan sat at the small table, his injured leg propped on a stool, a cup of coffee cooling before him. The older man's face was drawn with worry. Do you think they'll make it? Mason poured himself a cup of the strong brew before answering. Rebecca knows the trail, And Fletcher's no stranger to hardship despite his calling. If anyone can get through, they will. And if they don't, Joseph voiced the fear that hung between them. Mason took a deliberate sip of his coffee. Then we face Hammond on our terms, not his. The calm statement belied the calculations running through Mason's mind. 2 men, 1 injured, against Hammond, and however many hired guns he'd gathered for his midday plans. Not favorable odds by any measure. But Mason had faced worse and lived to tell of it. I never meant for any of this to happen, Joseph said suddenly, his voice heavy with regret. When I left Redemption, I thought I was protecting Rebecca. Instead, I left her vulnerable to Hammond's cruelty. You did what you thought was right, Mason replied, same as any father would. Joseph shook his head slowly. A real father would have stayed and faced the danger, not run from it. And likely gotten yourself killed for your trouble, Mason pointed out. What good would that have done Rebecca? The older man had no answer for this, his eyes fixed on the depths of his coffee cup as if searching for absolution in its dark surface. Mason understood the feeling all too well. The weight of choices made that could never be unmade, paths taken that led to unintended consequences. My wife used to say that dwelling on yesterday's mistakes steals from today's possibilities, Mason offered after a moment. Seems like sound advice, especially now. Joseph looked up, surprise flickering across his features. You were married? Mason rarely spoke of Sarah, but something about this moment, this day that might be his last, loosened the tight hold he kept on those memories. 7 years. Her name was Sarah. We had a small ranch in Colorado. What happened? Joseph asked quietly. Fire. The single word carried the weight of a tragedy Mason had shared with few others. I was away, delivering horses to a buyer in Denver. Lightning struck the barn during a summer storm. The house caught before she could escape. I'm sorry, Joseph said, genuine sympathy in his tone. Mason nodded once in acknowledgement. After that I drifted, took jobs with the Marshal Service, riding shotgun on stage lines, whatever came along. Didn't much care what happened to me. His mouth twisted in a humorless smile. That's how Caleb Reed and I ended up in Silver Creek. The confession hung in the air between them. 2 men who had lost much and feared losing more before the day was done. Joseph seemed to understand that Mason had shared something precious, a truth usually kept locked away. He offered his own in return. Rebecca's mother died bringing her into this world, he said softly. I've spent every day since trying to be both father and mother to her and falling short at both. You raised a remarkable daughter, Mason observed. Seems to me you didn't fall as short as you think. A ghost of a smile touched Joseph's lips. Perhaps not. The moment of connection was interrupted by the distant sound of horses approaching at speed. Mason moved swiftly to the window, his hand dropping instinctively to his holstered revolver. A group of riders, at least 8, thundered down the main street toward the church, Hammond and Caleb Reed clearly visible at their head. Looks like Hammond's not waiting for noon, Mason observed grimly. Joseph struggled to his feet, wincing at the pain in his injured leg. They must have discovered that Rebecca and the pastor are gone. Or Caleb told them. The possibility tasted bitter, but Mason forced himself to consider it. Had his former friend betrayed their confidence after all? There was no time to dwell on the question. The riders were already dismounting outside the church, their voices carrying through the morning air. Halt! Hammond's shout was commanding, accustomed to being obeyed. Come out and bring Sullivan with you. Mason assessed their limited options. The hidden room beneath the pulpit offered temporary sanctuary but would become a trap if discovered. Fighting from the parsonage might provide better defense, but would endanger the church itself. I'll face them, Mason decided. Buy you time to reach the hiding place. I won't cower while you risk your life, Joseph protested. This isn't about courage, Mason replied firmly. It's about ensuring the ledger reaches the judge. Rebecca and Fletcher need time, and your safety gives them that time. The logic was irrefutable, though Joseph's expression revealed his internal struggle. Finally, he nodded. What will you do? Mason checked his revolver methodically. 6 rounds in the cylinder, 12 more in his pocket. Against 8 armed men, the odds were impossibly long, but he'd never been one to calculate odds when principle was at stake. I'll remind Hammond why they called me the Merciful, he said quietly. While Joseph made his way to the hidden room beneath the pulpit, Mason moved through the church to the main entrance. He paused in the vestibule, drawing a slow, centered breath. Outside, Hammond's men had positioned themselves in a loose semicircle before the church steps, weapons ready but not yet drawn. Mason opened the door and stepped onto the porch, his hands deliberately empty and held slightly away from his sides. The morning sunlight caught the silver streaks in his dark hair, illuminating the scar that ran along his jawline. He surveyed the assembled men with calm assessment, noting positions, weapons, the tension in their stance. Wesley Hammond stood at the center, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, his silver-topped cane planted firmly before him like a scepter. To his right stood Caleb Reed, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Holt," Hammond called, his voice carrying the assurance of a man accustomed to power. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I have nothing of yours," Mason replied evenly. Hammond's smile was cold. Joseph Sullivan, in a certain ledger book, would disagree with that statement. "Joseph Sullivan is a free man who owes you nothing," Mason countered. "As for any book, I don't know what you're talking about." "Come now." Hammond took a step forward. "We both know Sullivan is hiding in there, along with evidence he stole from my office. I'm offering you one chance, Holt. Send him out with the ledger, and you can ride away from redemption unharmed." Mason's gaze shifted briefly to Caleb, searching for some indication of where his former friend's loyalties truly lay. Caleb's face revealed nothing, but a subtle tension in his shoulders suggested internal conflict. "Interesting offer," Mason replied, returning his attention to Hammond, "but I have a counter-proposal. Leave this church, leave the Sullivan family in peace, and when the territorial marshal arrives to investigate your business practices, I'll put in a good word." Murmurs ran through Hammond's men at this bold statement. Hammond himself appeared momentarily taken aback before his features hardened with anger. "You dare threaten me in my own town?" He turned to his men. "Search the church, find Sullivan and the ledger." Two men started forward but froze when Mason's hand dropped to rest on the grip of his holstered revolver. He hadn't drawn, not yet, but the message was clear. "This is consecrated ground," Mason said, his voice deceptively soft. "I suggest you reconsider." Hammond's laugh held no humor. "Hiding behind God now, Holt? Strange behavior for a notorious gunslinger." "Not hiding," Mason corrected. "Just giving you a chance to walk away." "I don't walk away from what's mine," Hammond snapped. His hand tightened on his cane. "Sullivan stole from me. The ledger is my property, and I will have them both." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, neither side willing to yield. Mason knew he couldn't hold them all off indefinitely. Each minute he delayed Hammond was another minute for Rebecca and Pastor Fletcher to put distance between themselves and redemption. "5 years ago," Mason said suddenly, his voice carrying to all present, "I swore never to draw this gun again after an innocent child died in a shootout. 3 months ago, I broke that vow to protect a family from bandits." His eyes swept over the assembled men. "Today, I'll break it again if necessary. But make no mistake, I don't want bloodshed on these church steps." The sincerity in his voice gave several of Hammond's men pause. They exchanged uncertain glances, their resolve visibly wavering. Hammond noticed the hesitation and scowled. "He's one man. Are you all cowards?" "Not cowards," came a new voice from behind the group. "Just men who recognize when they're being asked to die for another man's greed." All eyes turned to see Mrs. Gunderson standing at the edge of the churchyard, a shotgun cradled comfortably in her weathered hands. She wore her Sunday dress, a simple but dignified navy blue with a lace collar, as if she'd dressed specifically for this confrontation. The determination in her stance reminded Mason of frontier women he'd known, women who'd buried husbands, raised children alone, and survived when the land and elements conspired against them. She was the embodiment of redemption's quiet strength. Behind her stood several townspeople, the blacksmith with his hammer, the barber with a razor, the livery stable owner with a pitchfork. Common folk armed with tools of their trades rather than guns, but their message was unmistakable. "This doesn't concern you, Martha," Hammond growled. "Doesn't it?" The old midwife stepped forward, unintimidated. "I held you as you took your first breath in this world, Wesley Hammond, and I may yet see you take your last. You seem to forget I've known you since before you could walk." Her voice carried across the churchyard, ensuring everyone present heard her words. You've squeezed this town dry for years, taken homes, businesses, ruined lives with your loan schemes. Her eyes narrowed. Including my nephew Jacob's farm, when his wife Emma was dying and he couldn't make your payments. The same Emma whose life I tried to save while you banged on their door demanding money. A murmur ran through the gathering townspeople. Many nodded, having witnessed Hammond's cruelty firsthand or heard the stories of the Gunderson family tragedy. Martha's long-held respect in the community was becoming something more powerful now, a rallying point for their collective courage. More townspeople appeared, emerging from side streets and alleyways. Not all were armed, but their presence alone changed the dynamic of the confrontation. Hammond's men looked increasingly uncomfortable, outnumbered now by ordinary citizens whose fear had finally given way to collective courage. Mason watched this unexpected development with carefully concealed relief. He hadn't counted on the town rallying, had been prepared to stand alone. The appearance of allies was welcome, but also raised the stakes. Any violence now would risk innocent lives. Hammond sensed his advantage slipping away. His face contorted with rage as he turned back to Mason. This changes nothing. Sullivan and the ledger, Holt. Now or there will be consequences. There already are consequences, Mason replied. Look around you, Hammond. Your reign over redemption is ending. Hammond's hand moved suddenly to his jacket, withdrawing a small revolver that had been hidden there. I built this town, he shouted, his composure cracking. Everything I've done for redemption. For yourself, corrected a voice from the church doorway. Joseph Sullivan had emerged despite Mason's instructions, leaning heavily on a walking stick but standing tall despite his injury. His face was solemn but determined as he addressed not Hammond but the gathered townspeople. Wesley Hammond has defrauded every business owner in redemption, he announced. The ledger my daughter and Pastor Fletcher are taking to the circuit judge proves it. Loans recorded at one rate, then magically increasing. Properties seized illegally, even blackmail and threats. Hammond's gun swung toward Joseph. Lies, he snarled. Sullivan's a thief and a coward who ran rather than pay his debts. I ran to find proof, Joseph corrected calmly. And now the truth will be known. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Hammond's finger tensed on the trigger, his face twisted with fury and desperation. Mason judged the distance between them, knowing he couldn't draw and fire before Hammond got off a shot at Joseph, but someone else moved first. Caleb Reed stepped forward, positioning himself between Hammond's gun and Joseph Sullivan. Enough, Hammond, he said quietly. It's over. Hammond stared at his lieutenant in disbelief. You too, Reed? After everything I've done for you? This isn't right, Caleb replied simply. I've done many things I'm not proud of, but I won't stand by and watch you murder an unarmed man on church steps. A profound silence fell over the crowd. Hammond's eyes darted wildly from face to face, seeing no allies, only witnesses to his downfall. With a cry of rage, he swung his gun toward Caleb instead. Traitor! Mason's hand moved with the blinding speed that had made him legendary. His revolver cleared its holster just as Hammond's finger tightened on the trigger. Two shots rang out in rapid succession. So close they sounded almost as one. Hammond staggered, a look of surprise replacing the rage on his face. His bullet had gone wide, striking the church door frame with a dull thud. Mason's shot had found its mark, hitting Hammond's shoulder and spinning him half around. The small revolver fell from his suddenly nerveless fingers. You shot me, Hammond gasped, clutching his bleeding shoulder. You actually shot me. Be thankful I aimed for your shoulder, Mason replied evenly, his revolver still trained on Hammond. The old me might not have been so merciful. Hammond's men, seeing their employer wounded and their odds dramatically worsened, began to back away. None seemed eager to test their loyalty further. This isn't over, Hammond threatened, his face pale with pain and fury. My friends in the territorial capital will what? Joseph interrupted. Overlook fraud, extortion, and attempted murder? I think not, Wesley. He nodded toward the gathered townspeople. Too many witnesses now. As if to punctuate Joseph's words, the distant sound of approaching riders drew everyone's attention. A group of men in the unmistakable uniforms of territorial marshals appeared at the end of the street, led by Pastor Fletcher. Rebecca rode beside him, her face lightening with relief as she saw her father and Mason standing unharmed on the church steps. Hammond sagged visibly at the sight. His empire was crumbling before his eyes, his carefully constructed world of power and intimidation dissolving in the clear light of justice. The lead marshal, a stern-faced man with a silver star pinned to his vest, dismounted and approached the scene, taking in the armed standoff with experienced eyes. "I'm Marshal James Cooper," he announced. "Judge Harmon has issued warrants for the arrest of Wesley Hammond on multiple counts of fraud, extortion, and corruption." "Add attempted murder to the charges," Mason suggested, finally lowering his revolver as the lawman took control of the situation. As Hammond was taken into custody, his protests falling on deaf ears, Rebecca rushed forward to embrace her father. Their reunion was touching. Two people who had endured separation and hardship, finally together with the shadow of fear lifted from their lives. Mason stepped back, allowing them their moment. He found himself standing beside Caleb, both men watching the scene unfold with complex emotions. "You stood with us at the end," Mason observed quietly. Caleb's mouth twisted in a wry smile. "Doesn't erase what came before." "No," Mason agreed, "but it's a start." They fell silent, the weight of their shared history both connecting and separating them. 5 years since Silver Creek. 5 years of different paths, different choices. Yet here they stood, side by side once more. "What happens now?" Caleb asked finally. Mason considered the question. "Hammond will face trial. With the ledger and all these witnesses, he'll likely spend years in prison." "I meant with you," Caleb clarified. "Where does Mason Holt go from here?" It was a question Mason hadn't allowed himself to consider until this moment. For so long, his life had been defined by running. From his past, from his guilt, from the man he'd been. But something had changed in redemption. Some burden had lightened. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "For the first time in a long while, the future seems open." Caleb nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The wanted poster for Silver Creek. I could tell the marshal the truth." "Clear your name?" Mason studied his former friend, recognizing the offer for what it was, a step toward atonement for both of them. "And what about you? Where will Caleb Reed go?" A shadow crossed Caleb's face. "There are other posters with my name on them, legitimate ones, for things I've done while riding with Hammond and after we parted ways." He sighed heavily. "I've got reckonings ahead that can't be avoided." Before Mason could respond, Marshal Cooper approached them. His shrewd gaze moved between the two men, lingering on Mason. "Mason Holt," he said, not a question, but a statement of recognition. "There's a poster with your name on it. Silver Creek, Montana, 5 years ago." Mason met the lawman's eyes steadily. "There is." "There shouldn't be, Caleb interjected. "Mason didn't kill that child, I did." The marshal's eyebrows rose slightly at this unexpected confession. "You're admitting to manslaughter?" "I'm admitting to the truth," Caleb replied. "It was my bullet that hit Emily Wilson." Mason took the blame because he faltered, the full weight of Mason's sacrifice perhaps hitting him anew. "Because that's the kind of man he is." Marshal Cooper considered this information, his expression revealing nothing. "That's a matter for Montana authorities to sort out," he said finally. "For now, Mr. Holt, I'm more concerned with the events here in Redemption." "Mason saved my life," Joseph Sullivan called, limping over to join them with Rebecca at his side. "And my daughters. Without him, Hammond would still be terrorizing this town." "He's a hero," Rebecca added firmly. "Whatever happened in the past, what he's done for Redemption deserves recognition, not punishment." Other voices joined in, Pastor Fletcher, Mrs. Gunderson, townspeople who had witnessed Mason's stand against Hammond. Their support was unexpected and humbling. Mason had come to Redemption seeking nothing but a night's shelter on his journey north. Instead, he had found something he'd thought forever lost: community, purpose, perhaps even redemption. Marshal Cooper held up a hand to quiet the chorus of defenders. "I have no intention of arresting Mr. Holt today," he announced. "The situation in Montana will need clarification, but given the circumstances and Mr. Reed's statement, I believe justice would be better served by focusing on Hammond's crimes for now." Relief washed through Mason, though he was careful not to show it. "Thank you, Marshal. As the lawman organized the removal of Hammond and the collection of statements from witnesses, the crowd began to disperse. Caleb was taken into custody as well, but not before exchanging a final look with Mason, a look that contained regret, gratitude, and perhaps a measure of peace neither man had expected to find. "I'll tell them everything," Caleb promised as the marshal led him away, "about Silver Creek, about Hammond, all of it." Mason nodded once, understanding the gift his former friend was offering. The truth, after so many years of silence, might finally set them both free. As the excitement subsided, Mason found himself once more on the church porch, watching as redemption began to absorb the momentous changes of the morning. Already there was talk of electing a town council, of reviewing Hammond's seized properties, of building something new from the ruins of his corrupt empire. Rebecca approached, her face glowing with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. "We did it," she said simply. "Hammond is finished." "You did it," Mason corrected. "You and your father. I just happened along at the right time." She smiled, seeing through his modest deflection. "Is that what you call facing down 8 armed men? Happening along?" Despite himself, Mason felt an answering smile tug at his lips. "Something like that." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the activity in the street below. Finally, Rebecca spoke again, her voice softer. "What will you do now, Mason, with Hammond arrested and your name about to be cleared?" The question echoed Caleb's earlier one, but carried different implications coming from Rebecca. Mason considered his answer carefully. "I've been running for a long time," he said finally. "Maybe it's time to stop." Hope flickered in her eyes, quickly tempered by caution. "Redemption could use a man like you. Father will be reopening his carpentry shop, and with his legs still healing, he could use help." The offer was gentle, without pressure or expectation. Just a door opening, should he choose to step through it. "I'm not much of a carpenter," Mason admitted. "But you're good with horses," she countered. The livery stable owner mentioned he's looking for a partner, someone who knows horseflesh and can help with the training. Mason looked at her with newfound respect. "You've been planning this." Her blush was answer enough, but she met his gaze directly. "Is that so wrong, to want you to stay?" Before he could respond, Pastor Fletcher joined them on the porch, his clerical collar restored now that his unexpected journey was complete. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, though his smile suggested he knew precisely what he was interrupting. "Not at all, Pastor," Rebecca replied, her composure returning. "I was just suggesting that Mr. Holt might consider making Redemption his home." "An excellent suggestion," Fletcher agreed. "We could certainly use a man of your principles, Mason, especially now as the town rebuilds." Mason felt a strange warmth spread through him at their words, at the simple fact of being wanted, not for his gun, but for himself. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself to belong anywhere, to anyone. "I appreciate the offer," he said carefully, "but there are matters I need to resolve first. Montana, Silver Creek." He glanced at the marshal's office where Caleb was being held. "The past." Pastor Fletcher nodded in understanding. "The past must be acknowledged before the future can truly begin. But remember, Mason, forgiveness isn't just something we receive. It's also something we must learn to give ourselves." The wisdom in those words resonated deeply. For 5 years, Mason had carried the weight of Emily Wilson's death, a burden made heavier by his voluntary assumption of Caleb's guilt. Perhaps it was time to set down that weight, to forgive not just Caleb, but himself as well. "I'll think about it," he promised, his gaze meeting Rebecca's. "Redemption does have a certain appeal." Her smile was like sunrise after a long night. "Then we'll be here when you're ready." The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Hammond and his closest associates were transported to the territorial capital to await trial. Caleb Reed, true to his word, provided a full statement about the events at Silver Creek, formally clearing Mason's name, though he would still face charges for his later activities with Hammond. Marshal Cooper sent telegrams to Montana, beginning the process of officially removing Mason from the wanted lists. "Might take some time for the paperwork to catch up," he warned, "but you're a free man as far as the law is concerned." The people of Redemption, liberated from Hammond's oppression, set about reclaiming their town. A temporary council was formed to address the most pressing issues: with Joseph Sullivan unanimously voted as chairman, despite his protest that he was no politician. They trust you, Mason observed, as Joseph fretted over his new responsibilities. That's rare and valuable in these parts. Through it all, Mason remained somewhat apart, helping where needed but making no commitments about his future. He assisted in organizing the return of properties Hammond had seized illegally, lent his experience to the marshal in sorting through Hammond's network of criminal associates, and even helped repair the church door frame damaged during the confrontation. But always there was a sense of impermanence about him, as if he might saddle his chestnut mare and ride away at any moment. Rebecca noticed, though she never pressed him. Instead, she simply included him in the daily rhythms of rebuilding, meals at the Sullivan home, discussions about the town's future, quiet evenings on the porch as sunset painted the western sky in gold and crimson. A week after Hammond's arrest, Mason rode out alone to the small cemetery on the edge of town. He hadn't told anyone where he was going, but somehow wasn't surprised when he heard hoofbeats approaching as he stood before the simple grave of William Hammond. Rebecca dismounted, tethering her mare beside his before joining him at the weathered headstone. "Martha told me I might find you here," she explained. "She said you'd been asking questions about William's death." Mason nodded, his eyes still on the inscription, "William Hammond, beloved son, 1863 to 1882. "Trying to understand Wesley Hammond," he said. "The man, not just the criminal." "William's death broke something in him," Rebecca said softly. "He was always hard, always ambitious. But after William was killed in that bar fight, Hammond became," she searched for the right word, "hollow, as if he'd lost whatever humanity he had left." "Grief does strange things to a man," Mason observed, thinking of his own dark years after Sarah's death. "Twists him into someone he might not recognize." "Is that what happened to you after Silver Creek?" Rebecca asked gently. "After your wife?" Mason had never spoken of it directly, but he wasn't surprised she had pieced it together. "Maybe I lost my way for a time." "And now?" Her question hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning beyond its simple words. Mason turned from the grave to face her fully. The setting sun gilded her features, catching the auburn highlights in her hair. In that moment, he saw not just Rebecca Sullivan, but all that she represented: courage, resilience, the possibility of beginning anew. "Now," he said slowly, "I'm starting to find it again. My way." Her smile was gentle, understanding. "And does that way lead through redemption or beyond it?" Mason had asked himself the same question countless times over the past week. The open road had been his companion for 5 years, the constant movement a shield against memory and connection. Staying in one place, letting down roots, it carried risks he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Yet the thought of riding away from redemption, from Rebecca, from the tentative sense of belonging he'd found here, felt increasingly hollow. "I've been offered a partnership at the livery stable," he said finally. "Jenkins needs someone who can handle the more spirited horses. Says my way with them is worth half ownership." Hope brightened her eyes, though she tried to contain it. "That's wonderful. Will you accept?" "I'm considering it." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "There's nothing holding me to redemption except—" "Except?" she prompted when he fell silent. Mason took a breath, stepping closer to her. "Except the feeling that I might find here what I've been looking for all these years without knowing it." "And what's that?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Peace," he said simply, "a chance to be more than my past, to build something instead of just surviving." The confession cost him something to make, pride perhaps, or the armor of detachment he'd worn for so long. But as the words left him, Mason felt lighter somehow, as if setting down a burden he'd carried too long. Rebecca's hand found his, her touch warm and grounding. "Redemption was just a name on a map until people made it real, Mason. Maybe that's true for all of us. Maybe we're all just looking for a place where we can become who we're meant to be instead of who we were." And the wisdom in her words struck him deeply. This small town, with its struggling businesses and ordinary people, had offered him something he'd forgotten existed. Not just a physical home, but a spiritual one. A place where mercy outweighed judgment, where the future mattered more than the past, where redemption in all its forms was possible. As the last light of day faded and the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the eastern sky, Mason made his decision, not with grand declarations or sweeping promises, but with a simple question that contained within it all the hope and possibility he'd denied himself for too long. Would you have dinner with me tomorrow evening, Rebecca? Not as fugitives or allies against Hammond, but just as us? Her smile was answer enough, but she squeezed his hand and replied anyway. I'd like that very much. They rode back to town side by side, their horses matching pace naturally, their shadows stretching long before them in the golden twilight. Ahead, the lights of redemption began to appear, one by one, like earthbound stars guiding them home. Mason Holt, once known as the Merciful, felt the last pieces of a burden he'd carried for 5 long years finally begin to fall away. The road ahead was uncertain, as all futures are, but for the first time since Silver Creek, since Sarah, he faced that uncertainty, not with dread, but with hope. The price of mercy, he was beginning to understand, wasn't paid in guilt or penance. It was paid in the courage to begin again, to risk connection, to believe that even the most wounded heart could heal. As they crested the final rise overlooking the town, Rebecca turned to him, her face illuminated by the rising moon. "Welcome home, Mason," she said softly, and for once he allowed himself to believe it might be true.